Well, Bob Huggins took a $1 million fine and an undetermined suspension from West Virginia for homophobic remarks he made on a Cincinnati radio station on Monday. We're going to discuss the remarks. We're going to discuss whether it was a big enough punishment from West Virginia or if he got off easy right here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is up? Welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton, and I'm joined today by Leif Thulin of the Locked On NBA Big Board and a regular guest here on Locked On College Basketball. And Leif and I got some fun stuff to talk about later in the show. We're going to continue our NBA Draft Declaration series. We're going to talk about Villanova's Cam Whitmore today. We're also going to close out the show discussing the NBA Draft Combine. The list got revealed. We're going to talk about the players who are there and pick a couple that we're most excited to watch at that event next week. But we have to lead off the show with the biggest story in college basketball right now. Bob Huggins, the longtime head coach at West Virginia, longer time head coach in college basketball, went on a radio show in Cincinnati on Monday to talk about the rivalry between Xavier and Cincinnati, his old school. Of course, he coached at Cincinnati from I think 1989 to 2005, some really long stretch of time that he was there. Some bad blood between them and Xavier, but he went on the radio show and used some extremely inappropriate language that I'm not going to repeat here. He was referring to them as Catholic. And then he used a word that I will say is a word used across the pond to talk about cigarettes. That's the best way that I can describe what he said. Most of you probably heard the story or maybe even heard the audio, which for me, I talked about this on my other show on Locked On Zags. Listening to the audio was worse. Like it sounded so callous the way that he said it. It was so just conversational, like jokey. The other radio hosts really didn't seem bothered or perturbed at all by what he said. It was a pretty distressing listen. I'm not going to lie to you about that. And we kind of were wondering what was going to happen. How quickly was West Virginia going to act here? Obviously, really poor timing with the transfer portal window about to close, and these players don't want to find out, is my coach going to be here next year or not? It sounds like a report from Pete Thamel of ESPN came out just a few hours before we're recording here, Leif. Report came out that he is going to stay on as the head coach at West Virginia. He's signing an amended contract that basically effectively serves as a $1 million fine. He's going from a $4.2 million contract to a $3.2 million contract. There's going to be some sensitivity training. There's going to be a suspension. All of that, I think, is coming down the pipeline. And I know we're reacting to this more or less in live time, Leif, but I'm curious your kind of initial thoughts on how quickly West Virginia acted here and what the ultimate result ended up being based on what he said.
Well, I think the first thing is to address, like you said, the ease with which he said it, I think hurt him more than if he issued an apology right away and it was, oh shoot, shouldn't have said that. I think the timing was weird, but the timing also behooved Huggins because of the fact that the transfer portal window was closing. So when you get arguably the best recruiting transfer class in the nation, and the school is keenly aware of that, and this is kind of a staple at West Virginia, like Bob Huggins, in my opinion, would be gone if he were not Bob Huggins. He is a big name in college basketball. If that was a new, plucky coach at West Virginia who just brought in the same transfer class, I think he's gone. He was awarded a lifeline for his achievements over his lifetime. So I think the timing of his horrible, I want to say slip up, but it didn't feel like a slip up at all. On the radio was poor, but it also was lucky for him to retain his job because of when college basketball's requirements are. Because if this was 2 weeks prior, even, I think he's gone. Yeah, and now the class is settled. And to answer your initial question, I just wanted to kind of backtrack there for a moment. I do think the reason that he's retained is because they want to keep the portal class the same, rather than if they, let someone go, those guys go, and the coach has a barren cupboard with no ability to refill it. And I think for them, it made more sense monetarily because when you win in basketball, you make money.
Yeah.
And when you're a school like West Virginia that's had a really good program over the past 15 years with Bob Huggins, more or less, you're going to try to retain that money. And so I do think the situation is horribly unfortunate, but I think West Virginia was put between a rock and a hard place. And so this was somewhat surprising in today's climate that this is how easily it was resolved. But it makes sense from a basketball only perspective. Not saying it's correct, but I think that's the logic that they use to determine it.
Sure. And we're just in an era where winning cures all. And I mean, I don't know that we've ever been out of that era. I think we're just now more hyper aware of people making mistakes is more likely to get reported and more likely to get commented on. But like Chris Beard has a job, it's obviously very different situations, but
he got that 2 months after.
Yeah, it didn't take him very long at all to get a job there. And there's some debate on Chris Beard's situation. I don't want to really get into that right now, but there's absolutely zero debate about what happened here. There's nobody's saying, well, Bob Huggins didn't actually say that. That's not part of this conversation. He very clearly said it. Some people have beliefs that what he said isn't as bad as it is, and I would pretty strongly disagree with those people. I think that was a pretty abhorrent thing to say, and to say with the just casual nature. It's clearly something he said before. I guess that's the best way that I can put it, and something that he doesn't seem to have a lot of discomfort saying. And the fact that the radio hosts didn't immediately toss that audio clip in the trash is an indication that it's not something that really bothered them all that much. And I think there's a completely legitimate reason to be mad and upset and hurt and any emotion that people might feel here. And I do understand why. You're absolutely right. West Virginia was put in a really tough spot from a timing perspective here. And I think it's probably good that they acted quickly. And part of it is out of their own self-interest of not wanting to lose players in the portal. But part of it is just seeing these things get dragged out doesn't really help anybody. And Texas got a lot of credit for also acting fairly quickly in the Chris Beard situation. And I do think that colleges and universities are more kind of in tune with how you have to handle these situations when they come up. Ideally, you just have less and less of them. But Bob Huggins is a guy who's been around for a really long time. It's not like this is his first time. I mean, he's gotten a DUI on his record and he's still coaching. He's gotten a lot of chances, and that's not unusual to society to see people who have success in their career, who are powerful, who are rich in any of those things, kind of tend to get more opportunities. And I think part of this is like you said, West Virginia didn't want to lose Kirk Risa or Jesse Edwards or any of those guys that they added in the transfer portal. And I don't blame them for that. You lose those guys, you're probably going to finish last in the Big 12. But I wonder if it will have an impact on certain players, if they'll make, I don't think we're going to see 4 guys from West Virginia enter the transfer portal today or tomorrow. Maybe we will. I doubt it. And I don't blame them. I think that players are in a really tough spot right now. We're choosing to leave, even if you are upset or offended by this, even if you have family members who are in the LGBT community and you are not happy with what Bob Huggins said, making a decision to leave your school at this point is really risky. And it's unfortunate because I think there are probably going to be players who feel stuck in a situation where maybe they don't want to be because of this. But that's kind of just the nature of the sport, unfortunately. And it's sad to see for so many reasons, of course, to see Bob Huggins say this and do this and get away with it with, $1 million suspension and or $1 million fine, and the suspension is not nothing, but it's not a ton either.
Yeah, it's chump change for what he's made in entirety.
Yeah.
So in like I mentioned, you got to contextualize the whole situation of when it happened in terms of the basketball dates. And that's because the portal window is closing.
Yeah.
And for him, the money, I think, sounds like they're punishing him. Mm-hmm. But anyone privy to the way college basketball coaches get paid knows that this is just a slap on the wrist.
Yeah.
And I think he's keenly aware of the mistake, but the key distinction is just the ease with which he said it. Just tossing around an epithet that is so outdated and wrong, always was wrong, but it is now the world is so in tune to this type of stuff. Mm-hmm. And so he said it before, as you mentioned, just with the ease with which he's slaying the epithet around. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the more perturbing part of it, rather than the fact that he actually said it, because it happens in private settings. So to me, to answer the basketball player situation, I don't know if that'll be the biggest deterrent to these players, because I'd hazard to guess that they're committing for basketball only,
right?
And so if the coach is there, they'll be content. Obviously, I don't think it's something that, makes them super thrilled to be there.
Sure.
But I wonder, like I mentioned, I think winning cures all, but also in terms of talent curing all, like that helps winning. And these guys think that their talent can be best utilized at West Virginia. And that's why they went there with their second chances in college. And so I feel like West Virginia could very well have a good team this year. And this be tossed by the wayside by all but people like you and I and people in the media who remember it, because and then there's going to be Huggins' next recruiting class, and they say, wow, look how good like West Virginia was this past year. And I think the slap on the wrist will West Virginia, the university, will be pretty pleased with their decision because they have a good basketball team. And I don't know if I morally don't agree with it, but I think that's the way the business is right now.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting time right now because we're talking about how people are probably just going to move on from this, and it's not very fun to move on from this, but that's also what we're about to do because we have more things that we want to talk about here on the show. I'm sure we will revisit this conversation as we see more of what happens if there are players who end up entering the portal or players who speak out about this. We'll definitely revisit the conversation. But for right now, we're going to continue our NBA draft declaration series. We're going to discuss Villanova one and done guard Cam Whitmore. Leif, I know you got some exciting stuff you want to share about Whitmore, so we're going to get into that. But before we do so, today's episode of the Locked On College Basketball Podcast is brought to you by Built Bar. If you're looking for a delicious snack, but you don't want all of the sugar and calories, and if you're like me, where you want to make healthier snack choices, but you don't want to compromise on taste, then I've got just the thing for you, Built Bars and Built Puffs. Built Bars are healthy and they taste amazing. Seriously, they taste so good that you will not think that they are healthy for you. What makes them so good? Well, for starters, they're covered in 100% real chocolate. That's right, real dark chocolate. And they come in unbelievable flavors like churro, peanut butter brownie, and cookies and cream. I'm not sure how Built does it, but these bars taste like a candy bar while maintaining amazing macros. Then they have 130 calories and 4 grams of sugar with a whopping 17 grams of protein. And now you don't need to wait around to get a box. For years, we've been talking about ordering your Built Bars at Built.com, but now you can get them at your local Walmart or Sam's Club, while you can still get your specialty flavors at Built.com. So head to the nearest Walmart today, walk into the pharmacy section, and grab yourself a box of Built Bars. You can pick up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puff. And if you're close to a Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with our hit flavors, brownie batter puff, and churro puff. You can thank me later. Built Bar, a proud sponsor of the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen every day. For you everyday listeners, Isaac Shade has got you the next 2 days with some fun transfer portal updates as we see the final players who are entering the portal, expecting some potential movement in the next 2 days here. So Isaac's got you all covered to close out the week. And next week, we're going to talk a bunch about the NBA Draft Combine here with our friend Leif, who is going to be in attendance at the Combine next week. Very excited to get some of that insight as we look towards the NBA Draft. And that's what we're going to start with here. We have done these draft declaration series with Leif ever since the season ended. For those of you who are interested, you can go back through our feed. You can find them. There's a YouTube playlist called Draft Declarations. We've talked Brandon Miller. We've talked Keontae George. We've talked Anthony Black. We've talked Jarris Walker. Last week, we talked about Grady Dick out of Kansas. And today, another one and done, another true freshman coming out of the draft. That is Cam Whitmore. Whitmore, he dealt with an early season injury that kind of slowed the roll on him a little bit when he was out to begin the season. He still ended up playing 26 games, so he didn't miss a ton of time. Little limited early in the year, but ultimately finished the season averaging 12.5 points per game, 5 boards, 1.5 steals. Leif, just initial impressions on Cam Whitmore. What are your thoughts? He's kind of been a bit of a divisive prospect, in part because of some limitations that he had at Villanova. But where are you at with Whitmore right now, looking at him as a draft prospect?
Yeah, I'm really high on Cam Whitmore. I have him as a top 5 pick. And so that I know is somewhat surprising because of some of the way they started the year, the fact that Villanova wasn't a tournament team, which is shocking to say based off recent years. But if you really boil it down to, excuse me, if you were to boil it down to athleticism, accolades coming into college, and then performance, I think he passes all through with pretty good, I wouldn't say flying colors, with pretty good colors here. Coming in, he dominated the U18s, the FIBA U18s, and then he jumped up to the number 5 recruit in the country. And then on my draft board entering the year, I'm not saying this is for everyone, but I had him top 5 entering the year.
Mm-hmm.
And then here are some percentiles I dug up from Synergy Sports. And that takes into account, for those of you who aren't familiar, it takes into account all sorts of basketball plays, and they quantify it as like that's a drive.
Right.
What is that percentile for spot up shooting? What is it for isolation? And it's all within the flow of a game, and then you can watch all their clips. So I've done that for him, and I've watched plenty of Villanova games in general. But here are some stats that stand out. And this is without cherry picking. These are just typically the ones I use to gauge athleticism, shooting, and then creation. So he's 86th percentile in spot up shooting. That's considered excellent. 90th percentile in isolation, also considered excellent. He's 65th percentile in transition, considered very good. 77th percentile at the rim, also considered very good. 85th percentile in unguarded catch and shoots, excellent. 79th percentile in guarded catch and shoots, and that's very good. And then his 91st percentile in early jumper, which is what they quantify as like a mid-range pull-up. So that's offense. I understand that. But if you take someone with that type of athleticism and apply him defensively, I have no concerns there. And by the end of the year, if you watch Villanova closely when they were playing their best, Justin Moore came back, took the reins offensively and defensively. Who was guarding the best perimeter players? That was Cam Whitmore. So to me, he's one of the best athletes in the draft. I think he's a top 3 or 4 athlete in this draft. I think he's a very good shooter, as the numbers would dictate here. And I think he's got more offensive game than Villanova allowed him to demonstrate, because they had a poor shooting team and one that was still veteran oriented without a mastermind drawing up the plays in Jay Wright. And so that was the first time you'd seen them having to really scramble to find offense rather than it coming as a second nature. So yeah, Cam Whitmore to me is a guy who, one, has a high floor, but I also think he's got a very high ceiling. I don't love to throw out comps, but I'll throw out a high end comp and then what I think he is. My high-end comp is Jaylen Brown. And then what I think he more than likely will be is a slightly better version of Miles Bridges. And before Miles Bridges had some legal issues, he scored 20 a game for the Charlotte Hornets. And he was a phenomenal athlete at Michigan State. And when he came out of Michigan State, he was a top 12 pick, and he was a sophomore. I think Cam Whitmore was better as a freshman than Miles Bridges was as a sophomore at Michigan State, and that was still a lottery pick. So there's my pitch for a guy like Cam Whitmore.
So you have him 5th on your board. Does that mean he's 2nd among college players, 1st among college players? I guess it depends where you have the Thompson twins.
Only behind Brandon Miller for me for college players.
Wow.
And those are the 2 I've had at the top all year. And I've wanted to adjust it, but I don't think anyone's in the college ranks is close to them in terms of their potential star power. And that the one person I'll put in, but he's different, is G.G. Jackson. I think he's got as much star power, and he's number 7 on my board, but he's very different because he's kind of an unknown commodity. You'll have to work with him. He's more of a project, so to speak. And I put that in air quotes for those of you listening on the podcast form, because he's younger and he played on such a terrible college team. He projected differently than do Cam Whitmore and Brandon Miller.
Well, definitely excited to get into G.G. Jackson another week. To me, it feels like he's a slightly lower floor prospect than Whitmore is, which is probably just because he's a bit more unknown. But staying on Whitmore, for me, what are the things you mentioned? Defense a little bit, and then that the defensive, the defense is more projection right now, I suppose, than it is actual results on the floor. Is that what you would consider his biggest weakness? If he drops in the draft, or if teams are willing to pass on him, do you think that that's the primary reason why? Or are there other things that maybe stand out to you that he's still got some work to do on?
I think the main thing that evaluators pick up bone with is his passing, or the lack thereof. He was not a very good playmaker, and he had a fair amount of turnovers. That said, I think you got to contextualize it a little bit. He came into the year late. He missed 7 games, which I know isn't enormous, but when you're a highly touted freshman going to a team that's got such high expectations, guys that just made a Final Four run. Granted, I know they were missing Gillespie. I know they didn't have Jermaine Samuels, but 3 of those players were huge contributors on that team. And then you're tasked with being hey, you're going to be a spark plug offensive player, as opposed to the guy. Nor is he's neither the guy, nor is he just a 4th guy just kind of contributing. He was used as a spark plug scorer. I think it's hard to adapt that way, and I thought he got better throughout the year at not necessarily assist type passing, but just ball moving. And he's not a type of guy that is going to give you a ton of assists unless it develops into such a star that he's going to be the on-ball guy and then has to develop his passing. but that's not what you typically draft for. Like, for instance, a guy like Jaylen Brown, who I mentioned could be a high-end outcome for Cam Whitmore that I think is feasible. He's not someone that you're like, wow, Jaylen Brown with another assist. That's just not the evaluation. Right. He's a two-way defensive and offensive star that is a supplementary star in a very good basketball team. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's all you can wish for. So I think that's the biggest bone they pick offensively. Defensively, I think it's just the consistency with which he played, because I think there was times he was very, very good on defense. And then there were times where he just didn't show the effort. And I'm not as concerned about that, just because I think freshman year you learn at a rate where you get better. And when they play their best basketball, is because he was defending the best players. And so that doesn't bother me. I also think if I'm really picking a bone here and being nitpicky, I would say he kind of premeditates. Like when he goes left, he's shooting a jump shot. When he goes right, he's shooting a layup. Mm-hmm. But that, to me, the fact that everyone had that on their scouting reports and he was still able to do it actually is more impressive than the fact that he's predictable. So, I mean, even the weaknesses for a guy like him were strengths, in my opinion. And that's why, to me, he's a top 5 player.
Well, we're going to have more on Whitmore and more on the entire NBA Draft Combine next week, and that's what I want to talk about here to close out the show. The list of players invited to the Combine was revealed on Tuesday. Leif and I are going to pick a few players we're excited to see participate in this event coming up right after this. All right, segment 3 here, Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Andy Patton, your host, with you here, joined by Leif Thulin of the Locked On NBA Big Board, ahead of the NBA Draft Combine coming up very shortly here this month. I want to talk a little bit about the group of people who were invited to the Combine. We had 54 players from the Power 6 conferences. My co-host Isaac Shade broke this down on a great tweet on Twitter. Follow him at Isaac Shade if you don't already for a lot of great college basketball tidbits. 54 combined players from the Power 6 conferences, 12 from the SEC, 11 from the Big Ten. Those were your winners. From a conference perspective, 10 mid-major players, 4 from the WCC, 2 of them from Gonzaga, 3 from the AAC, 2 of them from Houston, who are not going to be a mid-major school for much longer, and then 2 from the A10, and then a handful of others. And then only 10 players who are non-college players, 4 who are international, 4 from the G League Ignite team, and then couple from the Overtime Elite team as well. So, Leif, before we get into some specific players we're interested in, I'm curious if you were surprised by the kind of spread here. I think there's always this fear that things like the G League or the international talent are going to like take over college basketball. And I think that those fears have kind of subsided in time. But you look at this list, I mean, 10 non-college players is all that we're seeing at the NBA Draft Combine. Perhaps there'll be more who get drafted or who get signed, but it feels like college basketball is still kind of how things run in order to get into the NBA. Is that kind of the impression you get here too?
Yeah, I mean, when you break it down, even with some of the top talent in the NBA draft not coming from college, like you've got 4 top 6 players probably not coming from the NBA draft, you still are going to see 45 drafted players come from college in my opinion. So it's still the most likely pathway for high schoolers to make the NBA. And I think it's become more and more catered to the NBA game. There's more spacing and shooting. I think the colleges are getting older, which is making freshmen stand out less.
Yeah.
But it's still like developing them for the way the NBA is starting to play, more so than it was prior, which would have been the real reason to go play at G League Ignite, should you have the ability to do so, because they played NBA style. Right. And then if you go play pro in Europe, I mean, the reason for that was money, and now there's money in college. So I think it's becoming catered to the NBA, like what the NBA wants, and then it helps those high schoolers choose like, hey, this is a good financial pathway, and it develops me for the NBA. So I think you'll continue to see this coming forward.
And I think that the perceived death of the one and done is a little bit overblown too. In case in point, I rattled off the list of players that you and I have discussed as NBA draft declarations: Miller, Keontae George, Black, Jarris Walker, Grady Dick, Cam Whitmore. Guess what? Every single one of those guys was a one and done player. They're all expected to be, if not lottery picks, first round picks, certainly out of that group. So I do think that you're still seeing plenty of players choosing that route. You're obviously seeing more players stay in college for longer periods of time. Like it doesn't feel to me like we're really kind of entering any kind of era where college basketball is not still the obviously preferred or dominant route to get into the NBA. What I want to do now, Leif, is I want to talk about a few players on this list that I'm most interested and that you're most interested in how they're going to perform at the NBA Draft Combine. Obviously, there are guys who are hopefully going to excel, guys like Whitmore, and what these one and done freshmen are these superstar first round guys. But there are a couple other players that I think have a real opportunity to do some significant damage to their NBA draft stock, as well as players who could rise significantly by performing well. And the first guy that I want to talk about is a mid-major guy that I saw a lot of this year as a guy who watched all the Gonzaga basketball games, and that would be Maxwell Lewis out of Pepperdine, a guy whose draft stock kind of dropped throughout the year because he fell victim to the same thing that everybody who plays for Lorenzo Romar falls victim to, which is that he gets good players and the teams are still bad. And Pepperdine was not good last year, and Maxwell Lewis did not look good on the defensive end of the floor, but he is still a hyper athletic wing, still has a lot of scoring ability. I think the upside is still really high, but I'm very curious to see what he looks like in this situation, in scrimmages, if he participates against other kind of similar athletic players. He obviously got to play against some high-level wings in the WCC, like Julian Strawther, of course, from Gonzaga, who's also going to be there. But I want to see him kind of in a different situation, because if he really pops at the Combine, I think that could do some really serious positive things for his draft stock.
Yeah, he's an interesting one because I think he's at the cusp of type of players that might want to participate in the scrimmage and show themselves look, I'm not just a WCC empty stat getter. And I'm not saying that he's Jalen Williams. I want to preface that. But Jalen Williams showed up, and there was people like, oh, yeah, he's pretty good. He scores pretty well on Santa Clara. And he wowed everyone. Yeah. Goes number 12 in the draft, and then is an all-rookie first team.
Right.
So I don't think he actually has the capacity to follow that. And if he does, credit to him, and I hope he does.
Right.
But I mean, that's the pathway that I hope he follows. So I hope he plays. And that's the thing about the comment that I'm eager to see is which players that I think could be first-round picks. And I'm eager to see everyone, but the first-round picks, I really would love to see some of those guys who are borderline first and second try to improve their stock rather than hide. So here are a couple players that are from different conferences in college basketball that I think have a chance to improve their stock this weekend. The first one for me is Kobe Brown from Missouri.
Yeah.
This is someone that I discovered fairly early because one of my good friends was like, hey, do you know this guy Brown on Missouri? And I was like, yeah, he scores pretty well. I just kind of knew of his stats. I'd watched it once or twice. And then I watched his film, and I was like, my goodness, he's shooting 42% from three. He's got enormous hands. He's kind of strong. He's not a typical NBA build.
Right.
But he moves his feet, shoots the ball very well, and he's big. And so I kind of put him to my draft board, and I didn't get any comments about it because he was lower on there. But the more I watched him, the more I was like, you know what? I can see him being an early second-round pick. And as recently as yesterday, I was talking with one of my kind of scouting friends, and he sent me a text. It was anonymous. I don't know who said it, but he said, Kobe Brown's a beast. It's a paraphrase, but it's pretty close. Kobe Brown's a beast. I can see him going in the first round. So that's the first one. I'm curious to see how he performs, because I think he'll shoot the cover off the ball, and I hope he plays in the actual Combine, and you'll get a serious feel for how he plays defense, because Missouri itself wasn't great defensively, but I thought he showed decent flashes.
For me, the last one that I want to talk about, and then we'll get to your final one there, Leif, it's another mid-major guy. I have a soft spot for mid-major guys, especially seeing how they perform in these kind of environments. And it's Grant Nelson from North Dakota State. And I think a lot of people are going to have their eyes on Grant Nelson because he has entered the NBA draft. He has also entered the transfer portal, and he is being recruited by everybody. Kentucky's in on him. Arkansas is in on him. Gonzaga has reached out to him. The list goes on and on and on of other high major programs who would be really interested in adding this guy to their team. And for good reason. He's 6'10". He blocks shots well. He has good ball handling skills. The outside shooting is a little bit inconsistent, but I think that it's easy to see the pathway to him becoming a consistent outside shooter, which would just really kind of round out his overall skill set. But he's been very adamant about wanting to stay in the NBA draft process. And the big question is how he looks at, he's going from the Summit League to the NBA Draft Combine, and going to be around a bunch of really talented players. And I have a lot of confidence that he's still going to look good, but how does he handle the physicality? How does he handle the uptick in athleticism around him? Can he knock down outside shots? If he plays in the combine or plays in the scrimmages and doesn't shoot particularly well, I think that that's going to really hamper, because right now he's a fringe draft pick. He's a guy who could raise his stock all the way up and be a comfortable pick, or he could kind of fall out of it completely and choose, hopefully in that situation for his sake, choosing to then go back to school and go to a high major program and hopefully play really well and find himself back in that NBA draft process. But he's a guy who I think there's a pretty wide range of outcomes on how this could go, which is why I'm really curious to see how it shakes out for him.
Yeah, I've got another one that is kind of a late bloomer into NBA draft discussion, and then I've got one that I think's been on the radar but just hasn't played an NBA draft style. So the first one is Bobby Klintman from Wake Forest. He's someone that I remember getting recruited as someone who's a fan of Virginia basketball. I remember he was getting recruited, and I was like, man, like he's drawing comparisons to DeAndre Hunter. I mean, I'm not opposed to this. And then he goes to Wake Forest. He has a really nice ACC tournament. It was short-lived, but it was a nice performance in the two games he played, and he had a nice close to the season. So I'm curious to see how he performs, because he's got all the traits that NBA executives would look for in terms of taking like a swing pick in the early second round. So that's someone I would like to see stick in the NBA draft if he performs well. The other one I mentioned, Virginia, Reece Beekman, to me, has played excellently for Virginia. He's been a great floor general. He's the best defender on ball of any guard in the country. He won ACC Defensive Player of the Year. But what I think he's best out in offense is pushing the pace and driving. Virginia doesn't do that. So I'm curious how he fares in an environment that allows him to use his best attributes offensively, because you know what his defense is. And then I've got one more that just because I really like watching him, and I watched him in person this NCAA tournament, and that's Trey Alexander.
Yeah.
I like Trey Alexander a lot. I think he's going to be an early second round, could even crack the first with a good combine. Smooth shooting, all his metrics on synergy are really impressive. And when you watch him at the eye test, you know he can just create space and score. So I think there's an ilk for him, a pathway for him in the NBA to carve out a role, even though he's kind of like a diminutive two guard. He's not small, but like you don't see too many 6'3", 6'4" two guards. And but I think there's a pathway for him. So those are kind of a quartet of guys I'm eager to see.
Well, Leif, we're very excited to get some insight from you after you get a chance to go down to the NBA Draft Combine and see these players. We're looking forward to having you back on Locked On College Basketball here to talk about those guys, which players stood out, which players maybe didn't stand out, what that might mean for them as we get closer and closer to the NBA Draft. But that is going to wrap us up for today. Again, we got more transfer portal targets to talk about in later episodes this week. We're going to continue to talk about any more updates that happen with Bob Huggins, with the NBA Draft Combine, with anything going on in this beautiful game. So check us out on the Locked On College Basketball podcast. It is available wherever you get podcasts. It is also available on YouTube. We just crossed 900 subscribers. Our goal is 1,000 before the NBA draft. I'm very confident that we can get there. So if you're listening and you have not done so yet, just go to YouTube, search Locked On College Basketball, hit that big red subscribe button. All right, that's going to wrap us up for today. So for now, peace out.